Hi, everyone. Welcome to the poetry module of the summer 2020 English 1102 class for Mr. Smith. So, here's what we're looking at. I'm hoping that all of you have completed and turned in your essays and quizzes for the prose module because you had 2 weeks to do it, and now those 2 weeks are over. So, at this point, we are now starting on the poetry part. Now, there's good news and bad news. The good news is that the poetry readings are much shorter than the short story readings. Very quick poems. The only poem that's of any length to speak of is Daddy by Sylvia Plath. And I included that one because it is such a good poem. Remember, for your poems, I have included the PowerPoint slideshows that will help you to understand them. But, understand that Emily Dickinson was one of the greatest American female poets. In fact, she, in conjunction with Walt Whitman, defined what American poetry would be. Of course, I have to include William Shakespeare. And so I've given you My Mistress's Eyes Are Nothing Like the Sun, which is Sonnet 130, which, truthfully speaking, may sound like he's insulting his girlfriend, but this is a satire. He's not poking fun at this girl. He's truly poking fun at poets who take women and put them on pedestals, whether they deserve it or not. And particularly poets like Petrarch. And so I think you're going to find that even though, he's talking about her bad breath and he's talking about her wiry hair and whatnot, he's just saying, hey, my girl is real. Whereas Petrarch's women can't possibly exist because they are just too perfect. All right? Road Not Taken by Robert Frost, one of the best American poems ever written. Robert Frost is a American poet who was in the early to mid 20th century. He was such a good poet that John F. Kennedy had Frost write a poem for his inauguration. But Road Not Taken is about, well, do I make this decision or that decision? And he doesn't say that one decision is better than the other, so per se, but he does say that whatever decision he makes will make all the difference in his life. And many of you may be too young to understand that now, but for those of you that are a few years advanced, you'll understand that, well, you can look at one decision and say, well, that made all the difference. Whether it's good or bad is up to you. Langston Hughes. Oh my goodness. Langston Hughes is probably one of the most influential African-American poets of the Harlem Renaissance. He wrote two poems that I'm having you reading, which is Harlem and Negro Speaks of Rivers. Truthfully, Harlem, even though it's a short poem, you really need to put some thought into it. And what he's saying is a dream deferred. That's the whole point about Harlem, is what happens if somebody has a dream but it doesn't get fulfilled right away. It gets deferred to a future time. And when he's talking about that dream deferred, he's talking about the dreams of African Americans during the 1920s when the Jazz Age was going on. He wrote Harlem in 1951, which says, hey, our dream has been deferred. What are the negative consequences of that? And then, of course, Negro Speaks of Rivers. That's a wonderful poem. It talks about the soul of the African American race altogether. And so this narrator isn't just a single human being, but he's the entire African American race over many years. And then Daddy by Sylvia Plath. I know that most of the time when you read your poetry, you are supposed to separate your narrator from your author. But in Daddy, they may very well be the same one. Sylvia Plath has some daddy issues because he died when she was very, very young. That caused her anger and caused her to marry a man very much like her daddy, which many women will do, in Ted Hughes, who is an author himself. And This poem by Sylvia Plath called Daddy is a young girl working through her anger issues at her father. So, these are the poems you have to read for the poetry module. Now, the textbook reading is much longer than the prose portion that you read before, but these poems are so short, I feel justified in doing that. So, take the poetry quiz, write your poetry paper, look at the document I have about how you quote poetry correctly, because I am very much a stickler on MLA formatting, and so you have to format properly when you quote your poems. But I really do think that you're going to enjoy these readings. I chose them because there's such a wide variety, and because there's so much diversity, and because these are themes that are very relevant, especially when we get to Langston Hughes and the fact that we have all these George Floyd protests and so on and so forth. I really think that Harlem and Negro Speaks of Rivers will speak to that, particularly the poem Harlem. That one will really speak to those. So with that in mind, happy writing, and do remember that you need to stay on schedule, and if you want me to read a poem or an essay of yours about one of these poems, then you need to submit that in enough time for me to give you the feedback that you need to get this right.